Hi, I'm Nigel Walker, and this is Photo Stories. And this week, I'm going to be talking to Nick Walster about just one photograph that he's taken, and it will help us to explore the way that he works and his reasons for doing that. Nick is a person who first got a camera at 15 years of age on his birthday, took to photography immediately, led to develop his own black and white images, and subsequently attended the very first, and indeed at that time the only, university course in photography, graduating from Central London Polytech when he had finished. He was lucky enough then to get a job on a cruise ship, or cruise company, and sailed around the world for a few years taking photographs as he went. Um, During that time, he also developed his artwork, which in some ways runs alongside his photography. He eventually had a show at the Musavi Gallery in New York City, eventually was offered a job there and went to live in New York for more than 30 years, returning to the UK with his family in 2017. Hi, Nick.
Hi.
Anything that I've missed out of substance there?
No, I think that was pretty comprehensive. Yeah, that was good.
Thank you. We only get a chance to say a few things in these things because they're relatively short.
Right.
So I can see an image beside you. Would you like to tell us about that image and say how it fits into your work?
Sure. So this is a photograph of a sculpture of St. Brendan the Navigator. The sculpture's by a guy called Eamon Doherty, and it's in County Kerry in Ireland. The sculpture itself, I think, was done in the mid 90s, and I took the photograph in the year 2000 when I was there with my wife, who at the time was 8 months pregnant, and we were visiting from the States. We lived in New York at the time, and we were en route to my parents, who lived in Beverly at that time. Um, so the image is, as I say, of St. Brendan, and St. Brendan is a fascinating figure for me because he is one of what they call the 12 apostles of Ireland. And the anecdote is that he discovered America uh, roughly 1,000 years before Columbus. So
Right.
his dates are, 5th century AD. I think he died in 500 or something. And, as I say, it's anecdotal. There's various stories about it, but Tim Severin, who was the head of the National Maritime Museum in London in the 1970s, decided to attempt to duplicate St. Brendan's trip. So he was able to get this particular boat, which is made of animal hide, made, and he went with three other people. Tim Severin did. And basically, he proved that it's possible, and he made a documentary in the mid 1970s to show that. So, it's kind of a very um, symbolic image for me in that it represents adventure to the unknown, um, and it's an act of complete faith. Um, and I I just love the simplicity of it. So I don't know if it comes across easily, but there is basically a cross, the moon-shaped boat, and the four men looking off in the distance, and it's kind of suspended above the landscape. So it's got a buoyancy to it that kind of duplicates the journey for me. Um,
You've also obviously got some writing across the top of that. What's that about? What's the significance?
Okay, so the significance is, as you described in the introduction, I went to the Polytechnic of Central London in the mid 1970s, and I basically was a very naive Yorkshire lad who had gotten into photography since, as you mentioned, since I was 15. And I was very much into the kind of the pure visual expression of photography as art, as I saw it at that
Mm.
time. When I went to the PCL, the Polytechnic of Central London, I was somewhat dismayed to discover that it was kind of a hotbed of Marxist philosophy. And one of their underlying principles was what they called semiotics, which is the study of sign, how they call it the sign. And my understanding at that time was that they believed that every visual experience, and indeed auditory experience, so music, all of the arts, music, dance, visual arts, um, have to go through the perceptual apparatus of language before you, as the observer, can actually come to a visual conclusion about what it is. So it goes through various steps, and I very much poo-pooed that notion. I wasn't really interested in that whilst I was at university. And it put me kind of in strong opposition to the faculty, I suppose you would say. And that was certainly true of the first year when a guy called Victor Bergin ran and Stephen Whaley. Victor Bergin has gone on to become kind of a guru of semiotics and of text within images, etc. And as I say, it put me at loggerheads with them, and so I love my time at college, but I didn't feel like I got the best out of it. And I think what happened for me was that years later, in my own discovery or my own looking into, I guess you would say, overall meaning, or or the kind of the attempt to understand what my own motivation was behind images. Um, I did kind of sympathize with this notion that everything that we see is based upon our own perception. And
Right,
our perception is defined by language and culture. So the specifics of this are that this is my writing from a series of journals that I kept from starting my job on the cruise ship when I was in my early 20s. Um, and I kept the journals basically throughout the majority of my life. And they symbolize for me in the way that I've presented this image. What they symbolize is the world that we see is kind of through the prism of our own perception, and the perception is a linguistic perception
yeah,
generally. So that is the kind of the symbol of it,
right,
and the specific way in which this is presented, and I don't know if it's easy for people to see because of of the problems with technology, etc. But basically, this is a frame within a frame. So I've got um, an internal frame that's covered in what I call funereal velvet, and the reason I chose that is because when we first had children, we moved from New York City up to upstate New York in the Hudson Valley, and I kind of went there with this kind of concept that I was like a pioneer and I could do anything, and that involved chopping down trees and doing all kinds of things. And we had this beautiful willow tree in the back garden, which was actually the highest tree in the locale. It was about 70 foot high. And therefore, it was always subject to being hit by lightning. And on
Right.
one such occasion, it got hit and it looked really ugly. And, because I believe in aesthetics, I didn't want to live in a house that had an ugly
An
willow tree.
ugly tree.
So, so I went about researching how do you, because I'd never done it before, how do you prune a willow tree, etc. And what it talked about with a chainsaw. So what it talked about was that you're supposed to undercut the branch 2/3. So you see, 1/3 of the way out of the tree, 2/3 up, and then you move back and you cut it close to the trunk.
Right.
Um, so this branch was about 22 foot high. So I went up there with my chainsaw and followed what I understood to be the instructions. And when I went up 2/3, the weight of that branch was such that it just fell and severed the ladder that I was on. So I fell 22 feet with a chainsaw. And in that time, which actually I then figured out that it's less than a second, but
Wow.
it felt to me like it was
A
several
long
minutes.
time. I
Yeah.
can imagine.
I had um, a vision of several of the kind of what I call, my iconic images that I'd taken. Because at that point, I'd been in photography for 40 plus years, uh, or 30 years, I think, at that point. And so, whilst I was falling, I had this kind of kaleidoscopic film reel of various images that I'd taken, presented exactly like this, which is in an inner frame with a funereal velvet surrounded by black with an internal light.
Yeah.
And so I basically set about figuring out how I could do that. And so this was one of the very first pieces that I did after that.
Well, I know that you've now done several of them, and I'd certainly say to people, your website details will be at the end of this broadcast. I'd recommend you going and having a look at Nick's site. Nick, has this appeared any with this particular image? Is there an afterlife to it, as apart from the obvious ones you've talked
Yes, so
about?
the image itself. So I've created in essence different versions of this. One is just the image itself, because this is in essence I'm restricted to size with this
Yeah,
particular way of presentation. Um, but I've presented a much larger, so 1 meter square image, which was in the Ferrens, I think a couple of years ago. Um, so, that's kind of the latest
yeah,
version of it.
yeah.
Um, but I did show, when I was living in the States, I had a gallery called the Musavi Gallery. At the point that I created this work, that gallery had actually closed. But I've showed several of these works, in New York
In New
City.
York. Yeah.
So
I know you've shown a lot of work in various places, including on the continent, and you've had a lot of work in publications as well. So, well worth looking at your website. Thank you for talking to us today. Um, I'd say that Nick's work is extremely interesting, particularly that idea of semiotics and using print with a photograph and putting those two things together in the way that Nick has. So, thank you, Nick. That's been very enlightening.
you're very
And no doubt people will make their way to your website. Too sweet.
Merci.
Bye for now.
Bye.